And you won't really remember all the times that you played it safe, ultimately. But you
Mm.
might remember a time or two when you took a considerable chance with how you felt about yourself and let other people in on the gamble so that they could feel the possibility that it's not just them, you see. They see you trying and it does something to them.
Mm.
And that's really what village mindedness also includes, that you proceed knowing that there are witnesses. Reward their witness.
Thank you for your time and coming on the show in the depths of winter. Um,
You're welcome. First
and you're
interview I've done this year.
Oh, it is. Well, happy New
Yes,
Year.
sir.
Sorry.
Yes, you too.
Well, we're only 2 days in, so you must have a fairly rigorous schedule then.
Yeah, we'll see.
Well, I'm glad to have gotten you fresh in 2025.
Thank you.
Uh, you're obviously very well known for your work, as you would term it, in the death trade, and speaking to death, and particularly in our Western culture, our inability to face death, or integrate it into life. And the first starting point that I'd like to begin with is, what do you see as the main thing that we lose as a culture what bereftness do we face when we're unable to look at death squarely?
Well, your vision suffers.
Hmm.
I mean, your capacity for vision suffers because it goes two-dimensional. It goes, what favors you and what you agree with. But the depth, the adversarial depth of life, depths, I should say, plural,
Hmm.
are lost to you, of course, when you're trained that the whole thing is measurable in terms of how it favors you. And I mean, it's not peculiar to the West, but it is the way by which the West is recognizable elsewhere,
Hmm.
or Western people are recognizable as such elsewhere for sure.
Hmm.
So, so that I mean, when you lose your capacity for depth in life, it's a very jittery business thereafter. I mean, you're kind of doing Marcel Marceau in the glass house, moving this way, up, down, left, right, up, down, left, right, and it's morose, isn't it? It's
Hmm.
actually reminds me of there's an episode in Margaret Atwood's first book. I think it's her first book. It's called Surfacing. It's very close to her first, if not her first.
Hmm.
And the scene that she recounts, and you'll recognize one of her favorite themes in the story, is a kind of sensory deprivation experiment that they're doing on rats. And what they do, of course, is deprive them of sight and stimulus of any kind in a kind of labyrinth. At the end of one of the labyrinth hallways or passageways, there's a bar that's connected to a battery. So there's an electrical charge that's completed every time the rat inadvertently touches the bar. And it's quite a jolt. I mean,
Hmm.
it's not fatal in anything, but it's alarming if you're a rat, I'm sure. So the discovery of the experiment went like this. At first, the rats bumped up against this thing, usually accidentally, and reared away from it and got as far away as they could figure out how to do. But as the experiment wore on, they found to their remarkable surprise that the rats actually began to seek out the charge, to seek out the quote, the stimulation, the drastic
Hmm.
stimulation.
Hmm.
And Atwood's uh, conclusion was that it was apparent that rats prefer any sensation to none at all. Any sensation to none at all.
Hmm.
It's very prescient observation, and not just about rats, of course. And it goes a long way towards explaining so-called comedy today.
Mm.
The stand-up comedian routine today. It's a, it's a kind of, what would you call it? It's a parody. The obscenity itself is a parody. And so it stands to reason that this is a direct consequence of when depth fails you, or better to say, when you fail at depth.
Mm.
Be not surprised that stimulus for its own sake is a kind of stand-in.
Mm.
So I think that's what's happened. So we lose a lot. We lose our ability to lose, for
Mm.
example. I mean,
Mm.
losing is not a passive event. It's an active event. Elizabeth Bishop, I don't know if you've heard of her. She was a contemporary of Al Purdy, I think, actually.
Okay. Yeah.
She was originally born in Atlantic, Canada, but grew up in New England, and subsequently is known worldwide as an American poet. But she had her beginnings in Canada. But she had a poem called One Art. And the initial stanza goes something like, "The art of losing isn't hard to master, for everything that was made with the intent to be lost, so that losing it is no disaster. Practice losing something every day." Well, I mean, if you've lost your understanding of depth and the necessity of depth and the God-givenness of depth, it's not surprising, is it, that you would be disinclined where losing of any kind is concerned, which sets you up for a rather chaotic, carnage-strewn trip down the last third of your life, as endings of all kinds begin to show themselves.
Mm.
And you were, just before we started, you were alluding to this has come to call in your life and people that you know.
Mm.
Given your age, it's not surprising, of course.
Mm.
But all these things become gross intrusions into life if you've had not the practice of not only welcoming, but learning the art of losing.
Mm. I see it here where I'm from Australia, where we don't have, obviously there's deep and tens of thousands of years of indigenous culture and wisdom and knowledge which
Yeah.
integrates death into its framework. Whereas if I look at the colonized section of the country, we don't have really any culture to speak of aside from the god of consumerism and materialism. And look, I can only speak to the generation which I can witness, but the boomers in particular who have gone down that path, and there's a lot of wealthier, probably similar to Canada, where there's been a lot of wealth generated and there hasn't been a lot of meaning. Not the same amount of meaning has been generated, and I see a lot of very aimless suffering in that generation with nothing to tether them to a deeper reality. And I don't think there's a point of trying to find who's to blame for that or what's to blame, but what would be, in your view, some way back from that? Is there a way back toward a deeper understanding of life, or is that something that potentially just does fall upon the individual in the moment of death, unfortunately quite late?
Yeah. Well, first of all, the assumption of the phrase finding our way back to whatever it was.
Mm.
The assumption of the phrase is that somehow there's a primordial connectivity to these matters,
Mm.
which remains alive and well, quote unquote, and I say this in heavy quotation marks, in indigenous communities, but otherwise is in short supply elsewhere. But still, we have an instinct for this and a longing after it, and led to the proper source, we're more than likely to, quote, take up where we left off. So you can tell I'm about to tell you that I don't think any of that's true.
Yeah, you're crushing the little optimistic bubble I have.
Well, it's only a bubble, man. It's not
Yeah,
a
yeah.
big lot, you
No,
know.
no. I'm ready for it. All right.
I say that with no sarcasm. It's not
Yeah.
a big loss because it's not there to begin with.
Mm,
Okay, so rather than thinking in terms of recreation, restoration, redemption, all the RE words, imagine that the work, first of all, imagine that that's what it is. It's not finding, it's not being stimulated. It's freaking labor now, what we're talking about.
mm,
It's a kind of spirit work,
mm.
is a favorite phrase of mine. And it's not where you work on your spirit, which is essentially the white wellness world that you probably have heard of.
There's a little bit of it around here. Yeah.
Sure, there is. Sure, the
Yeah.
Gold Coast is a good example. Yeah,
Yeah. There's a lot.
sure, sure. And places that have people who look like me
Mm,
have such places routinely. And of course, it speaks to the poverty of the beginnings. Of course, it does. But my enterprise, the school, and the other things that I've been engaged with over the years, I was obliged to concoct, if you will, a kind of a clearinghouse when they said to me, "You've got to have a website, for God's sake, you know." And I never agreed. I did it, but I never agreed that I needed a website. I didn't really know what it meant. And I'm not sure I understand much more now than, 20 odd years ago when we got into it. But they said it's got to have a name. Well, naming things I'm fairly good at. So I came up with a name, and I'd like to tell you why. I use the term orphan wisdom as a kind of an umbrella term to characterize my take on things,
mm,
right? And first of all, the orphan part. I mean, if you were to ask most people that you know, what's an orphan? Chances are very good that a very early answer you're going to get is something in the order of no parents.
mm,
Now, this is simply not true. That's not what an orphan is. No parents is a biochemical unlikelihood. Okay. Of course, you had parents. Certainly not the parents you had in mind for yourself, but that's not just true of quote unquote orphans in institutions. I mean, if you go down the list of a lot of people figure that they got their parents by some kind of goofball default or some kind of mayhem in the circuitry, that they didn't get the parents they deserved. Okay, so would they consider themselves to be orphan-like? Probably they would. But orphan means something much closer to this. There's you, there's your parent, and you can't get there from here. And there's a million folk tales to tell you, first of all, what happened that you can't get there from here and what you might do as a consequence of that. I mean, there's gajillions of them. So, it was a very common experience, not the narrow understanding of orphanhood, but this broader one that says your parents are somehow profoundly unavailable to you. So now if you imagine what I'm talking about as not having a sort of genetic reality so much as a cultural reality, a matter of cultural inheritance, the same observations apply. You can't get there from here. There is an indigenosity
mm.
that lies at the heart of where you come from, but you can't get there from here. Not because it's a punishment, but because it's a fact. You just can't. So there's a different kind of labor that befalls you if you're the seeking type.
Mm.
So all of that is bound up in the acknowledgement of orphan. And I'm a Canadian, and I'm a Canadian, a latecomer. I mean, my line came here at the beginning of the last century. It's not a long time ago, and it's not a lot to root oneself in. But for all of that, and there's a high degree of poverty that comes along with that arrangement. But there's also something else. And we have an obligation, it seems to me, those of us who consider ourselves culturally orphaned, to undertake the labor of recognizing that there is a thread, there's a line, there's an artery of legitimacy, profound legitimacy that binds you to something real. And so I call the undertaking orphan wisdom, not just characterizing the wisdom as an orphan thing, but all of those who are seeking after this wisdom are doing so as orphaned people would do.
Mm.
See, that's helps me remember what my undertakings are rooted in and why I'm much more in favor of the question than the answer and the wonder rather than the certainty. I mean,
Mm.
I can sound, relatively speaking, certain about things, but I mean, it's barely there. But I am fairly clear on how to wonder about things, and I'm proud of that. And it's a survival skill if you're culturally at odds with your time that you were born to.
Mm.
Yeah.
I guess it also leads into me. There's I'm not going to read it off my phone, but I'll butcher it. But there's a Henry Miller quote which I love about ostensibly it's not that men want roses out of this dung heap, but they won't look at the shit effectively, and they'll take any distraction over actually looking at what creates the rose, which is the shit.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, and I guess, and it's more of a potentially a statement than a question, but I mean, in terms of becoming an adult, would you say it is a case of the ability to look at one's own shit and to look at that shadow and to
Well, first of all, shit is fecund.
yeah.
It's we use it, and you've just used it now as a discredited cast off.
Oh no, I still mean no. I think it's the value of it is undeniable as it's what things grow from. I
Okay.
guess yeah,
Uh,
yeah. No. I meant in the sense of that we grow for it's the mulch and the soil. It's the things we don't see that actually grows the flowers.
well, it's a little more than that, though. It's
Mm,
also exactly what I just said a moment ago. It is the outcast, the turned away from,
yeah,
the poorly regarded. I mean, that
mm,
all fits the
it's true
description as
too.
well. I see.
Yeah,
And so that's where the shadowy notion comes into play, and lack of light, and all the things that when we're quick to agree, we find some commonality with the backyard garden. When we allow the rest of the story in,
mm,
you recognize that where do you suppose all that stuff comes from? The stuff that from which life seems to spring.
mm,
And generally speaking, New Age inclined people will say life somehow breeds life. That's the great, lovely,
mm,
unvarnished mystery of the thing. It's not true. Life does not generate life. Life consumes life.
mm,
Okay, and it's not an awful word to use to describe it. It's a very accurate word to describe it. That's the way humans are built, man. We're on the take. I don't mean that as a sort of moral failing. I mean that's a design principle. Is that we're amongst the most consuming of made creatures, right? So where does life come from if life itself is consuming all the time? You know what the answer is as well as I do.
mm,
Without death, there ain't no life.
mm,
Stuff has to die to turn into the dirt in your hand, right? That's what it is. It's death. And death is the life-giving proposition, the willingness. No, that's not the right word. The giving over of the enterprise to endings of all kinds, not symbolic endings, the real last thing. That's the big story. That's the big news. That's the big tent, as somebody called it to me a few years back. So that's what you have to sign up for as a conscious and human being who proposes to be a citizen of a time of trouble. Is
Mm.
that you got to sign yourself up for the work of ending, the labor of ending. I don't
It's
mean the end, the single, I'm not
yeah.
talking about your personal death here. I'm talking about the clusters of catastrophes, collapses, carnages of all sorts that give you practice at this matter. So that by the time it's your turn to die, man, you're kind of prone to it. You've seen a lot. You've heard it by now. You have maybe not a penchant, it's not the right word, but if your culture has had its way with you and it's a real thriving culture that's death literate, then the chances are very good you come to your death, first of all, not as a sudden thing, not as a surprise, not as a catastrophe, not as something uncalled for or beneath you or some kind of ambush or betrayal. You come to it as, oh, this is one of the marks of your citizenship.
Mm.
Not the only one, not the last one, because of course there's the whole matter of, so, friend, what has your life come to mean? And you don't have much of an answer for that. And you have to end your participation in your life for the meaning of your life to begin to congeal around what once was you. And that's what community's for,
Mm.
is to render out the meaning of your days. You don't get to hear it. That's not part of your entitlement. However, you were in on the making of meaning of an awful lot of people's days during the
Mm.
course of your life. So as you're dying, you realize again, if you're dying in a living culture, you
Mm.
know what will become of you. You genuinely know what will happen to you after you die. Man, that's a thought.
Mm.
It's in the hands of the living. It's not supernatural. It's highly natural.
Within that, for me, is the solution as well. If with the presence of death in your daily life, then it dictates your actions in a very different way toward what you just said for me, which is community and how you're behaving in life, rather than
If I hear you and I take the point that you're making,
mm,
and I would just offer this in response. If that were true, you and I wouldn't be talking about this now, and I would never have had a job in the death trade all those years.
it's definitely not implemented. No,
Oh,
it's
okay.
it's a
So,
lacks implementation.
right,
But
right.
yeah,
A bit of the delivery system, it needs a little work.
yeah,
Yeah.
just needs a tweak,
No,
needs
I
an
mean,
upgrade.
I know we're agreeing on this point here. The simple fact, the simple biochemical fact of death doesn't make anything happen. See, in the early days when I worked in the death trade, I was trying to come to an understanding, and I had to do it quickly, of what was wrong. And it was mostly a case of what was missing.
Mm.
And so when I started to do the work I ultimately became somewhat known for, people began to say to me, "Oh, I see what your take on all this is. Your thing is we have to talk about death. That's what you're trying to do, get us to talk about it." And I would say, "No, you should have asked me instead of deciding what I'm doing. I could have told you that's not the case at all. The problem has never been that we don't talk about death. The problem is what we say when we talk about it.
Mm.
That's where the dilemma is. It's in the
Yeah.
choice of the language, the kind of ethereal, disembodied language that's resorted to over and over and over again, where death disappears as you talk about it, rather than congealing around what you're saying. Such that I realized when I was working with dying people, man, I had a responsibility to them that they would never ask me to deliver on. And the responsibility was to speak to them and about them to their loved ones in a way where their dying was manifest in the language I was using. So they didn't have to braille about, you know,
Hmm.
they knew where they were because somebody was corroborating their death. That's what candor properly employed is supposed to do. It corroborates their ending,
Hmm.
even if they don't want that to be corroborated, which more often than not they didn't. So you have to appreciate that dying people were complicit in their millions. I mean, I didn't work with a million people, obviously, but I'm extrapolating from what I did see. And I'd say dying people are complicit in the disappearance of their dying. It's not like they're the victims of that. They were in on it the whole time.
Hmm.
So oftentimes I would say that my job was to get people to die,
Hmm.
which sounds, you know, aggressive and quote morbid and a bunch of other things. But it's rooted in the understanding that dying people were committed to not dying. And that's what they did with their dying time. They didn't die
Didn't I? Yeah.
as they died, if you take my meaning.
Yeah, no, I do. It's
Yeah.
it dovetails very much into the movement. I'm not sure if you're across it, but there's a huge movement now against aging and dying. Well, it's not new, but the idea, particularly that people now want to live forever, and there's a movement toward this, which naturally collapses into an embarrassment, also about getting older. Uh, and
Yeah.
I postulate, I just wonder if it's also like people are actually now embarrassed to die. Like they find themselves at this point deeply unprepared, and it's they can't deal with it, and we can't deal with it.
Yeah. I mean, did I see that? Yeah, I would say there were times when embarrassment was the order of the day, but I think it was closer to a kind of shame.
Oh Jesus, that's worse. It's much worse.
It's much worse because what we're talking about here is an illiteracy
Hmm.
that borders on a disability,
Hmm.
right? It's like, man, you never went to a day of mortality school. How the frig did you get to be your age and you were truant literally every day? Such that people will, honest to God, with a straight face, even after you pointed it out, they will say things like, you know, if I die, here's how I'd like it to go. And they think this is death literate because they're talking about dying. But they begin the whole proposition with if. And when you point it out, of course, they say, no, well, I meant when. Baby, if you meant when, you probably would have said it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's it's actually startling when you it's that barefaced. That
Yeah,
it's that is shown so much within the language. I just want to touch on some I've heard you mention before about that we look at flowers and the actual the flower the blossom the flower is actually the end point of that plant,
right,
and yet
right.
we attribute again with a misinterpretation of the language the flower of youth when it really should be the flower of death or the flower of old age. That beauty that we all revere should is something that is actually cultivated with time passing as opposed to with birth, unlike as opposed to birth.
Yeah.
We,
I mean, I know nothing of the Aztec language, but the language of flowering is very prominent in their understanding of death, decay, destruction, and the rest.
hmm,
From what little I've read and seen, I should say.
hmm,
Yeah. Um, Here's the thing. We're encouraged in the direction of self-sufficiency and mastery. And these are two indicators that you're getting it straight, right? That you're kind of
yeah,
got your paddle in the water and that you're heading in the right direction and
yeah, yeah,
etc. And I'm not saying that there's no merit to mastery and competence. Of course there is. And when it works, it works. But mastery and competence as an addiction works just as readily as crack cocaine works in the same fashion. How does it work? It inculcates in you the understanding. That's not the right word. The prejudice that you get a vote on every meaningful aspect of your life. This is called agency now, isn't it?
Mm.
And sovereignty now, isn't it? And if you think of the word sovereign, and you know who in times past, in generations past, who that referred to, royal families and the
Yeah.
rest.
Yeah.
You can see it's no revolution of any kind at all. It's a devolution from royalty to quote unquote the great unwashed mass, who apparently are as legitimately exercising sovereignty as the sovereigns once did. It's a fascinating idea that, you know, the sovereigns never really did much of a great job, historically speaking. And
Mm.
somehow we imagine if we just democratize the sovereignty, everybody is bound to do a better job than Queen so-and-so ever did.
Mm.
So just look around.
Mm.
How's it working so far? Us being in charge. I mean, radically in charge, shamelessly in charge, unhesitatingly, human-centrically in charge. So I was never really too preoccupied with the solutions nearly as much as I kept coming like a moth to a flame to the question of how did it get like this?
Mm.
I mean, you know, in the West, we're nursed on the sort of breast milk of the notion that once upon a time, things were magically great,
Mm.
that
Who used
everything
that?
was working, that
Yeah.
everything was clean, right? That everything was kind in some fashion, and that meaning and sense making were just happened every time you rolled out of bed in the morning, kind of thing. No. So then, if that's true, if that's your primordial paradigm, which you insinuate right into the firmament, that's what all the return language that we spoke about off the top, that's where it comes from. The notion that once upon a time
Mm.
was so good. So then let's just ask a very simple question. If it was that good, and let's not say it wasn't, let's say it was, how did it change? If it was that good, if it was self-evidently working,
Mm.
who among us would have ever tolerated for a moment the
Deviation.
degradation of that work? I mean, did we
Mm.
have a meeting one day and say, you know, we've tried happiness. It's been okay.
Yes. Not worth it, really.
But really, let's try chaos. I mean, such a meeting never took place. And yet chaos is very available. I should say too, etymologically speaking, crisis is a very useful word to characterize our times, but it doesn't mean what people use it to mean today. Crisis, as you can hear it, etymologically, it's related to cross, and it's a neutral descriptor of a moment and a place where propensities cross each other. And the question becomes, what now?
Mm.
And if it's unwelcome, then we use the word crisis the way we use it today. We're in a health crisis. We're in a ecological crisis and so on.
Mm.
I don't know that that's entirely true. I mean, I wish it was true, by which I mean, I wish the, the challenge, the throwdown was clearer than it is.
Yeah.
That was absolutely not subject to any kind of debate at all.
Mm.
You know, The Icelanders, I'm told, I haven't seen this, but there is a particularly wickedly retreating glacier. And the powers that be, either locally or federally, I don't know who did it, put up a sign at the foot of this retreating glacier. And the sign apparently said three things, something in the order of, we know what's happening. We know what we must do. Only you will know if we did it or not. Who's the you in that third declaration?
Yeah,
A lot of people
exactly.
say it's the future, it's the kids, it's the
Yeah.
unborn, and so on. Maybe. But Icelanders have a fairly staunch tradition of being animists before the Lutherans really got at them, right?
Mm,
And in their animism, I'm almost certain that that you is directed towards the glacier as a living, conscious thing, a
mm.
being. And they're addressing the glacier directly. Only you will know if we did what we know we must do. I mean, if all we needed was a crisis, we'd be much better off and the world would be a better place, honestly. And I say that with no irony. But crises are not enough to get most modern, sort of modernly fashioned people uh, engaged and working, fretting and hating and arguing and despising and more arguing, yes, but working directly in the presence of the better day that they claim to be seeking. Sadly, it's rarer than it sounds like it should be.
It's when I look out at the chaos that seems very evident when you're on any sort of news channel or engaging in downloading sense making from whoever's trying to make sense of it, and the incapacity of people to deal with that in any functional sense. As you just said, there's a lot of anger and resentment, there's a lot of shouting, a lot of finger pointing,
Yeah.
and I just think we're not. I just don't think we're wired to be able to deal with huge sways of people with different viewpoints, and particularly from a point of just deep individualism as well. Like, it needs to be my way, otherwise this way, otherwise it won't work. You know. Yet I saw. So we had up where I am. We had really bad floods a few years ago. Like, and the government were not to be seen. Like, no one turned up from the government until the work had already been done. Yet
Mm.
there was a huge. It's still small enough here. I think there's 20,000 people in in what's deemed the Northern Rivers, and the community coming together to rescue people. Like, literally, people paying money, their own money, to fuel helicopters to fly out and get people off roofs. Not, I know one guy spent $5,000 of his own money just to fish people off roofs, and not remunerated by the government. And it was a really horrific time in terms of obviously the impact and the devastation, but a beautiful time to see that people can come together in times of crises to help one another. But that's on a small scale. That's on a scale at which I think we can see a direct connection to our neighbour. And I've heard you, I am bringing this back to a question, but I've heard you mention the inability of us to think from a village minded set. And from my point of view, that would be exactly what a village mindset is. It's not the loss of your individual life, but it's also, your individual life fits into a much larger tapestry, which ironically will make you feel happier when you're a part of that.
Yeah. Yeah. It belongs to the tapestry.
Hmm.
I
It
mean,
has to.
explicitly belongs. You know, the question of belonging is a huge question for the the white European diaspora,
Hmm.
which made your country, which made mine and others as well, as we know. This question of belonging, it haunts, you know, it's just not a pleasing discourse. And it hasn't produced much in the way of pleasure either, while we're on the subject. But man, the etymology is so ripe. What does it mean to belong? Is it really just a feeling?
Mm.
Is it you know it when you got it, and when you don't got it, you don't know anything? Is that it? Is it you just bump into the wall when you don't belong, and as soon as you do belong, you walk through the doorway? Is that it? Is it that
Mm.
simple?
Mm.
Does belonging really work? Does it absolve us once and for all of what troubles us and what distances us from each other? Do people who belong together into a place, have they got it all figured out? Are they just fine? And the likes of you and I are carnage in the darkness? So, okay, so what am I saying with this sequence of questions? I'm saying the beautiful etymology helps, and it goes like this. So the BE prefix is an old English prefix, right? And it means that which follows this prefix is intensified because the prefix exists. It means oomph, it means more so, it means and then some, it means double down. And that's the essential consequence of the BE. So think of them all. I mean, there's literally scores and scores of them: beleaguer, bewilder,
Mm.
bedevil, beloved, befriended, beguiled,
Mm.
bejeweled, and so on. You take the
Yeah.
point now. And then the root word. When was the last time you described yourself as longing?
Mm.
Probably not very frequently. And probably you don't know why, except that there's something about longing it feels kind of frail. It feels so imprecise as to not be very effective. It feels like you're kind of on the receiving end of life rather than the doing end, and a bunch of other associations. But the verb to long, I mean, this needs a lengthy rendering out, which I don't have the time for, but the short version is the verb to long works like this. You can be in the presence of that which you long for and long even still. You can think of that romantically. That's the easy way of seeing
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
You're in the presence of the person you long for, and your longing peaks in their presence. It's not satisfied. It doesn't go quiet.
Mm.
You don't sit back and go, everything's okay now. You know, I'm finally in the presence of that which I seek. No, there's something about it that's beyond arousing. It does something else to you. It says, in the presence of what you long for, your longing becomes skillful, not acquisitive. And you can inquire after the needs of what you long for in your longing instead of getting your needs met by pursuing it. You follow what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So suddenly the verb to belong sounds a lot different now, doesn't it? Belonging is not what you can get to minimize what's befallen you
Aloneness.
or what besets you. Belonging is the code of participation in something larger than you. It's the mechanics of participation. Yeah. It's it's well, I mean, it thrills me every time I think about it. But now you see why it's so much work. And simply being born to a place as you have found where you are, as I have found where I am, doesn't confer upon either you or I some magic ability just to occupy the zone.
Mm.
We're frantic, we're fretful, we're unsure of ourselves, we have receding hairlines, and we don't know what to do about it. And all of this, I mean, I say that somewhat jokingly, but because my hairline's not receding at all.
Oh, you got a great hairline.
Yeah. But what I mean by, and I say this with great empathy for those who are beset by problems of belonging. I'm no less beset, but I'm not as persuaded as I once was that it's a problem to solve. It's a wonder to have.
Mm.
That's what I've come to understand in my advanced time here on the planet.
Mm.
I should tell you, we're sort of coming towards the conclusion of the time together here. Today's the second day of the year. And it was literally a year ago today that I received a diagnosis that I will not recover from. And I didn't see it coming. And I've lived this last year in presence of all these things that you and I are talking about, and
Mm.
this. And this is the guy who wrote Die Wise talking, and Come of Age talking, and three or four others talking. And I've had to find a way to figure out whether or not anything I was advocating for and on behalf of, and everything I had a good strong run at and challenge for, whether it still is fitting for me to occupy those places now, and whether or not there's a different kind of work that comes as a consequence of this news, you see. And I'm in the throes of trying to figure that out. And I'm glad I have the alertness of mind still to pursue it, but I don't have a lot of time to do that. So I'm glad for the opportunity, the invitation to wonder about these things, quote unquote, sort of one last time, which I understand the coming year probably to be. This is where I can sort of begin to do this a bit, to wonder in three dimensions, you know.
Mm.
So this is not to overhaul the proceedings or to bring everything to a shocking standstill. And I assume you didn't know anything about that,
Mm. No, I didn't.
right? But it's a question of it's the part of the quality of my citizenship now here is to occupy as deeply as I can find a way to do so. A place I would never have chosen. Although God knows I've had enough to say about it over the years, but I still wouldn't have chosen to be here. See, and I can tell you that being deemed by others to be an expert of some sort in these matters, it doesn't help. It's a different enterprise when it's you we're talking about, when it's
Mm.
your little life we're talking about. It's no less, it's not like everything was wrong until now and the last year has been suddenly startlingly right. That's not true. I'm just saying that there's gradations of clarity, you know, and some of them you come by easily because things are working well and your mind is working well and everything's available. And there's another kind of clarity that's asked of you when things are not. And the difference between the two is the difference between uh, potential and the functioning presence of elderhood in your life.
Mm. Stephen, your work and your words have really. I'm so appreciative for your time today and the work you've done. I find just the ability to think in a more, as you said, question more as opposed to look for these solutions or answers, which are often
Yeah.
very theoretical and not practiced or lived. Have given me in my own life a much stronger mooring to look out from. So,
Well, I'm glad, man. I appreciate you say so.
yeah.
And I had my equivalent in the formative years, you know.
Mm.
Nobody who worked the work, but the storyteller I apprenticed to as a young man, and a few others along the way have been more than enough, you
Mm.
know. And we really need to conduct ourselves not as if our personal demise is coming. I mean, that would be helpful, but it's not easy to translate, especially
Mm,
when things are, quote, going well.
mm,
No, I'm talking about recognizing that how you are in the presence of of your adversaries, with the young people looking on,
mm.
is what I'm talking about now. So that's basically what I have before me. And I'm saying that to you now because there will come a day or an era in your life when, and no one will say it to you, but maybe you'll remember that I said to you today, oh, this is that time I was talking about for me. Now it's come for you. Now, how shall you be in the presence of this great, unvarnished mystery? What does it ask of you to know that people not born today when we're talking are watching how you are in the presence of what would undo you?
Mm,
Yeah. And man, they're going to need some shining examples, no?
mm.
Because it's not going to be an easy time of things. I mean, globally and the rest. Well, we can do better than we're doing. And I say that with an uplifted voice. You know, we can do better. I don't think that that's a chastisement. If we can do better, we might. Wouldn't that be something?
Well, I get a sense too that it's if we can reinstate if we're so loose with our language on the whole in this
Yeah.
and we don't actually think through what we're saying and or even understand what we're saying, the true meaning of the words that we use. And this in turn creates a meaningless place that we find ourselves because it's gobbledygook unless what we say is what we mean. And that's I guess, and it's difficult because we're in a world which is flooded with information and people with it, and you're told it's good to have an opinion. And a place
Yeah.
I've arrived at personally is that there's so little I actually know about. It's like I know a few things about a few things that I'm very interested in, you could say,
Mm.
but everything else, aside from making a flippant joke from time to time, I really I can't have a view on, and that has made me a lot more, I guess, internally reflective on the things I can have a view on. And and to speak to just lastly, when you said what will the people who come after us think of us, a practice I received off someone many years ago was just that what kind of ancestor will you be? And I feel that's a question that most of us seem to have lost. It's so much about
Yeah.
our present life as opposed to what comes after we pass.
Yeah, but it's the wrong tense, man.
Is it?
Not what kind of ancestor will you be?
Well,
No, it's
give
not
us a
immediate
tense.
enough.
Yeah.
What kind of ancestor are you
Now.
now?
Yeah.
It doesn't start in the future. Your your being an ancestor doesn't start in the time to come. It's already begun.
Mm.
What are you doing to live as if that's so? Is the question. I mean, there's a few, but that's a big one. Change the tense. You feel the change inside you.
Mm.
You feel a sense of urgency and constriction in the throat.
Yeah.
Okay, so get past that. That's all. Just get past the paralysis that says, "Oh my God, everything's now." No, no, there's there's stuff to come, but you have nothing to wait for in terms of beginnings. The beginnings, you miss them entirely. So
Mm.
now make a revolution of getting up in the morning. I mean, take a, I'll end with this. People have been kind to me. And as the words got out about what's going on with me, I have a kind of eulogy kindness coming my way.
Sorry, I don't mean to laugh so loudly. That's very funny.
No, no, no. It is funny. It is funny too. It's a lot
Yeah,
of things.
really,
It's funny.
yeah,
And I lived long enough to get eulogized.
yeah. Whilst living.
Like they're practicing kind of
Yeah,
thing.
yeah.
But anyway, and one of the things they credit with me with is some facility with the language. It's the only language I have, so I did my best, and I recognize that there is some skillfulness there. So I'm not falsely humble about the matter. But the truth is, how did I, sorry, not the truth. The question is, how did that happen? Because if you look at my rather meager beginnings, you would never have targeted me for a guy who would end up being a guy you would want to talk to. And this is simply what happened. Somewhere along in addition to all the things that came my way, I had nothing to do with. But the one that I did participate in was I caught wind of the yogis somewhere along the way as a young man. And I was drawn not at all to yoga. I mean, not at all. Not then, not now.
Mm,
But there was something about the example
mm,
that wasn't extinguished. And it was simply this, as best as I could figure it out, what the yogis did was take something that they were going to do anyway and apply a degree of disciplined inquiry to the matter and see what could come of what was going to happen anyhow. In this case, breath. I did the same thing with talking. You're going to talk anyway. See if it can conjure, not just describe. Now, conjuring in and of itself is neither good nor bad, positive or negative, good or evil or whatever. I mean, it's still a question of how you will inflect all that stuff for the greater good. But hold yourself to a standard, man, when it
mm.
comes to talking. And in so doing, you're going to have to weather all kinds of acrimony and judgment and sneering and dismissal and all the rest because you're too serious, because you don't let up, because you don't get it, because whatever it is. Well, that's just part of the deal. And you won't really remember all the times that you played it safe, ultimately. But you
Mm.
might remember a time or two when you took a considerable chance with how you felt about yourself and let other people in on the gamble so that they could feel the possibility that it's not just them, you see. They see you trying and it does something to them.
Mm.
And that's really what village mindedness also includes, that you proceed knowing that there are witnesses. Reward their witness.
Stephen, thank you for your time, for your work,
Thank you.
and
Thank you
for
for
your
yours.
words and your conjuring.
All right,
And
man.
thank you so much.
Thank you for asking.